That's quite a few people in now, so I think we'll just make a start if everyone's happy to go. Grand. So, yep, thank you and hello and welcome to everyone to the LGBT Space Then and Now event for LGBT History Month 2021. We've got speakers from all around Scotland and we really hope you enjoy this event. My name's Christopher Ward, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm a health improvement coordinator with SX, which is Waverley Care's service to improve the health and well-being of gay and bisexual men and all men who have sex with men across Scotland. For the next hour and a half, we hope to talk about LGBT spaces in Scotland. We'll delve a bit into the history, the reasons why the spaces are so important to the community, and what the impact on the pandemic has had to these spaces. So today we'll be hearing from 5 speakers. So we have Oskar, who is the host of Glamour, Edinburgh's queerest cabaret, and they're also the owner and curator of the queer sober space, the Greenwood Cafe. Simon, DJ at Hot Mess, a queer dance party in Glasgow and Edinburgh. David Barbour, the coordinator of the Glasgow LGBTQI Substance Use Partnership. Alastair Rose, manager of the Essex Scotland project, which I spoke about a second ago, and Colin Mckay, who is an activist based in Aberdeen, and he works in the Drugs and Alcohol Action. So a bit of housekeeping. We'll hear from each speaker responding to the questions as we go, but we'll also have a Q&A session at the end, so you can put your questions in the bottom. So you can add them as you go. The question tab appears on the control panel at the bottom, and it should be towards the right hand of your screen. And also, please do note that this webinar is going to be recorded. So now to talk a bit about the history of spaces, particularly LGBT spaces in Scotland. So it's a really interesting and rich history we have, and I should say we're fortunate in Scotland that we have a number of great resources to learn about these histories. There are many to mention, but I'm going to talk about 2 specifically. So one is Our Stories Scotland, who collect and archive and present the life stories of LGBT communities here in Scotland. It's particularly helpful because it has personal experiences, but on their website, they also have an LGBT timeline, which I can highly recommend. Second is Queer Scotland, which is a website also. It's curated by Jeff Meek from the University of Glasgow, and it has loads of great posts and written pieces, but particularly for this talk, it's useful to note that it has a Google Map style plot of LGBT history spaces in Scotland from 1885 to 1995. So let's talk a bit about the spaces. So LGBT spaces manifest in a variety of ways, from places to have social gatherings, getting together. There's even spaces with accreditations as safe spaces for LGBT people, or there's just simple areas to cruise and meet for sex. There's many more beyond that as well. But ultimately, the space becomes defined by the people who inhabit them. For many LGBT people, these spaces are the first time that they see themselves represented. It's where they feel safe and they can experience a new world that prior was unimaginable. Historically, LGBT spaces would have been intended to be only visible to a few groups that are selected through fear of prosecution or violence. These could be cruising grounds like Colton Hill in Edinburgh, Queen's Park in Glasgow, or people who met in the privacy of their own homes. In the late 60s in Scotland, we saw the gathering of groups concerned with the rights of the community, using whatever space was available to them, from a parent's living room to the university chaplain centres. May 1969 saw the arrival of the Scottish Minorities Group founded in Glasgow, which had many branches opening across the country in following years. Beginning as a self-help organisation working to improve the rights of the communities, this made foundations on which things like the Gay Switchboard in 1972 were built, and the gay centres in Edinburgh in 1975 and Glasgow in 1977. As well as places of support and information in Scotland, we also had our places of joy and fun. We had Daisy's Disco in Aberdeen, which in the 70s and 80s hosted the best small disco in Scotland. Yet interestingly, like many LGBT spaces today, they also had to become multi-purpose. During the height of the AIDS epidemic, information about HIV would be given out in large LGBT nightclubs such as Fire Island, something that we continued right up to the closure of these places in the pandemic. And then in 1995, we had Scotland's first Pride March take place in Edinburgh, where information stalls were aimed to educate and inform the people. From these spaces, new spaces grow, such as Trans Pride Scotland was developed out of workshops at Pride Edinburgh and Free Pride in 2016. Now, one thing to be clear about is there are countless places worth considering, and we've only just really scratched the surface in this small introduction, but I think it's about time we get to some questions. So the first question we have for our panel is, why are LGBT spaces important, and what is it that makes them important for our community? And I believe Oskar is quite happy to take the first question.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so the importance of LGBT plus spaces, I think it's really, you sort of mentioned it, Christopher, but it's just this fact that it's really the places where you see yourself represented and where you see other people who have gone through similar issues and struggles as you. I think often the first time you go to, for example, a gay club, it's just this moment, this sort of clicking in your head where you go, oh, there are other people who've gone through similar experiences. I feel like all of us as sort of LGBT plus people go through either some form of discrimination, especially when we're younger, or even if we don't sort of suffer it directly, we have an idea that it's happening and that it could happen to us. And so to finally walk into a space where you see other people who in one way or another have gone through something similar, there's this elation and just this joy that comes with it. And I think that's so powerful. And I really tried to do that before the pandemic, when I was a drag queen, essentially an actual drag queen. Once I got my own show, that was really this moment of recognizing like, oh, right, I have a little bit of a platform here to create that space for people and to make them feel included and to make them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, let alone during the pandemic, where it was like, okay, we have to adapt for digital spaces. And I think even just digital spaces, let alone even things like this, these sort of conversations, really help people feel like they're less alone, because it can be quite lonely and sort of solitary when you're growing up as a queer person. So I think it really is just so life affirming to have a space to see yourself and others in your community represented.
Absolutely, and I think that's so true about actually just being able to see people like you and have that communal experience that you were mentioning before and creating that atmosphere as well. And Simon, I know you've done a lot of different DJing across Hot Mess in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And what do you think about why these spaces are important?
Thanks, Christopher. I agree with everything that Oskar was saying there, especially about the importance of being seen. Not being seen, but seeing other people who are like you. Like there was a quote I wrote down earlier. You can't be what you can't see. And I think having these spaces to like open up the whole kind of realm of opportunities that we have as being queer people, seeing the variety of lives that people can live, is really, really important. And yeah, it's a place of kind of, they can be places of refuge and respite from what can be a really cruel kind of heteronormative world. Place of safety away from transphobia and biphobia and homophobia. But I think just as important as a kind of, as them being places of safety and refuge, is that they're places of like joy and magic, where instead of like out in the world living as queer people, a lot of your existence is kind of colored by prejudice, disgust, and all that. And so to have a place where that just isn't part of the equation at all, you're kind of free of these burdens, which like they weigh heavy on people. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's a privilege to be able to provide these spaces for people.
Absolutely, and I think one of the unique factors about queer spaces is the lack of having to explain yourself. It's kind of, you're just accepted, you know that you can kind of explore different parts of yourself in these spaces because the tone is set. And Colin, what do you think about these kind of important elements of these spaces and what makes them important?
I think there's a one word that really stuck out for me that both Oskar and Simon said was joy. And I still experience that when I go into a club. One of my favorite clubs in Manchester is a club called Bollocks, and it's the Deaf Institute, and I love it. And I just walk in there, and it's just like, I feel like I've come home, And it's funny because I guess most of us have watched it's a sin. And I totally identified with my namesake, the character Colin, when he was standing, and I was that same guy with a shirt and tie and, you know, my pint in Daisy's in Aberdeen, thinking, you know, what the heck is going on? And while it was great being there, there was an element of fear being in there, because, you know, I'd been a good living Mormon boy, and it was like suddenly I'm in this completely different world. So, but I knew that, you know, as frightening as it was initially to be in there, that, you know, it was a safe space for me, you know, and I've got colleagues from my work. I think when this is the second time I've worked there, and I went after a Christmas night out, we passed Cheers, and they were all going to yet another straight bar, and I just declared I need to be with my people, and just left. And there is that, for me, that sense of, you know, being with my people. And I guess it's kind of tricky because, you know, Aberdeen, we've only got one bar that identifies as being a gay bar. And sometimes, you know, it's difficult because, you know, in other cities, bigger cities, there's choices, you know, there is more choice of places to go. And sometimes, you know, and I know there's a question coming up about mainstream and all the rest of it. And I think there's, you know, there are problems with that for me, that the whole mainstream aspect of it. But yeah, they are incredibly important, even nowadays, you know, and not just for the new young people coming out, you know, it still needs to be a safe space for, you know, with my work and with past work I've done with Switchboard and all the rest of it many years ago, and with Gay Men's Health, working with, you know, the older generation, you know, like in their 70s and that, and older, who have got such a rich history of LGBT experience. And it's like, you know, we still need to be offering them safe spaces to go to as well.
Absolutely. And I think that you're completely right, that spaces need to be open to all, and at least provide that kind of supportive environment. And
it's really interesting as well, because it's like, and it's a very, you know, I've been with my partner now for coming up for 6 years, and, you know, Manchester, born and bred and all the rest of it, but he's Nigerian. And it's like, he uses that saying, like Simon said, you can't, and I keep forgetting it, you can't see what you know, it's not.
You can't be what you can't see.
Yeah, you know, and for him, he's got a very different experience of gay spaces in Manchester, where you see, you know, he often says he's not gay enough to be, you know, he's too black to be gay and too gay to be black, you know. And it's just like, and again, often is the, you know, sometimes, you know, we're an all white panel, which, you know, I guess Scotland and all the rest of it, but it's like, it's really important that we, I don't know if we develop, or, you know, how do we support our, you know, queer people of color, and, you know, to come and, you know, feel safe in this space, and not be assumed that, well, you know, they can't be gay because they're black, or they're just there to sell drugs or whatever, which is a common occurrence when we go out, you know. But it's a whole different aspect of it. Sorry, just thought I'd throw that in.
No, and I think that's a really important point to talk about, is actually how these spaces are available to all, and how
mostly they're not.
No, and there are structures that are put up in place in these spaces that we've built that are kind of spilled over from other areas of the world. So it's important that we recognize those as well. And I think in the chat, one of the attendees, Drew, has just said, queer spaces are vital and valued. They truly are respite from the daily protest we march as queer people in a heteronormative world. And I think that's a really lovely way to put it, and a really apt way to put it. And Alastair, what do you think in terms of why these spaces are so important?
I think these places are our heritage, but they're also our, well, not right now because of a pandemic, but they're also our current, but they're also our future. And it doesn't matter what happens in terms of new technology, we always resort back. And I think what's come across is this phrase around can't be what you can't see, or whatever, you know. And actually, it was always, when I remember for the first time I went out into a gay bar, I won't tell you what age it was, but I wasn't old enough to drink. And it was, I want to be what I can see. And actually, that's really important still for young people, is to be able to see what they want to be. And actually, that acceptance, when you're going through a really tough time accepting your own sexuality and your own identity, it's really important to see what you as a person, as LGBT, as queer, can be. And I think that's something that digital technology can never replace, is that connectivity. And I think, you know, the other thing I would say is the role of community spaces and getting to where we are today in terms of the fight for equality, you know, HIV care and treatment, the prevention of HIV, it has to always be remembered, because it's without these spaces, we would never be getting to the point. We would never have this sort of responses to the AIDS crisis in the 80s without queer spaces. And, you know, and our equality, and a lot of people say we have equality now, and I don't agree with that, because equality is not just what you get in law. Equality is how society responds to you as well. We still have fights to fight. And our queer spaces might actually be just as important after the pandemic as they've been ever before for us. So I think they're an essential part of our life.
Absolutely, and they're so important to bringing that community together, and exactly what you were talking about in terms of where activism was focused, where people really got that sense of community. And David, I wonder what you think about the question about why are these spaces really important to our community?
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of what everyone else has said. That I think there is still a need for safe spaces. One of my employers, Scottish Community Safety Network, we just did some research on experiences of community safety, and not surprisingly, a lot of LGBT people still report not feeling safe in public spaces generally, or in non-LGBT specific spaces. And I think we can probably all sympathise with that up to one extent or another. Well, depends, I suppose, on our individual selves. But where obviously we still see people reticent to hold hands or to kiss in public, or and that's because there are still homophobic attacks happening in these spaces. High-profile ones recently of a couple of women on a bus down in England that was quite well reported in the news. So yeah, even just going about your normal life, I talk about a lot in our training that, and heterosexual people are who haven't really thought about it because they're not LGBT plus, suddenly go, oh, I didn't realise, I never thought about that you've got to like second guess yourself or constantly be vigilant against threats, potential threats run about you. So I think it's for those reasons really important. And I think it was Oskar kind of said about places to meet, but which also is just places to meet and to potentially meet partners is, I think, a big thing, because you don't, I mean, in the general world, how do you identify who's LGBT and feel safe to approach them? Because there is, again, that thing of maybe not feeling safe in case it's going to go badly, or not everyone's open to being chatted up and laughing it off if they don't happen to be the same sexuality. So it's potentially a sort of risky thing to do. And if you want to meet people in real life rather than on apps, then these spaces can be one of the best places where you're going to be able to do that. So
yeah, absolutely. Just places where you can build connections and relationships are so vital. We do actually have 2 questions from the audience. So the first one is, do you believe that many cis, heteronormative, racist, ageist or ableist gatekeeping style things are encroaching on queer spaces more and more? And how do you think we should tackle this? Quite an easy question. Whoever wants to go first.
I'm not sure if it's more and more. I think it's always, it's always been there. As as I get older, I'm very aware of the ageist element of the scene, which I knew about before when I was on the switchboard. And again, working, having been in a relationship with somebody who's a wheelchair user, but also working, I'm supporting people through switchboard who were disabled. And it was just like, the places just were not accessible for so many people because of if they had a disability, which meant they were either in a wheelchair or, mobility issues. But, I think it's always been like that. I don't know I'm not sure if it's getting worse. It's just more of the same. I don't know what other people's experience, because, you know, we are limited up in Aberdeen, of course.
I tend to agree with you, Colin. I think we've always seen it, you know, going back when I first went out in the 90s. It was there then, you know, it was there in the early 2000s, and it's there just now. I think just because it's an LGBT scene says it doesn't necessarily mirror, doesn't not mirror the prejudice that happens in society. It still does. LGBT people and queer people can be prejudiced as well. Internal homophobia is a huge problem, as you talked about earlier on, Colin. So I think what we have to do as a community is be able to challenge when that kind of attitude and behaviour happens, and confidently do so. Because people who are marginalised and the marginalised within a marginalised community need the communities to come around them and support them. And there is initiatives out there around about how to, you know, some venues have, for example, good policies, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in their venues. But I think we do need to come to a bit, it's a bit of a reckoning for us as a community when we're talking about this. The question that comes up is actually talking about it. So we need to do something about that. And that's a piece of action that we need to do as a community to make anyone who needs to access our community and our spaces do so safely.
Absolutely. And this is something that's been on my sort of mind a lot, and especially in the last year, whether it's because of the pandemic or not. I've come more to terms with the fact that I have chronic pain and sort of have sometimes difficulty walking and things like that. And that sort of opened me up, and I've sort of reckoned with that, and that's opened me up more to other disabled people and these talks about accessibility. And even what you were saying earlier, Colin, about like ageism and how these spaces might not be made for people of a certain age, etc. Sorry, ambulance passing by. And one of the things which really sort of struck me when we were opening the Greenwood Cafe was to make it a space for everyone. And part of our sort of angle was like, oh, for, you know, this can be a space for younger queer people, so like under 18, so they're not, you know, illegally going into a club, for example, and, you know, drinking alcohol and stuff like that. But then really one of the things that once we actually opened that struck me the most was seeing older queer people come in, and, you know, because it's a more quiet environment and they don't exactly want to be drinking, and so they sit down and have a coffee and a tea and some food or whatever, and sort of hearing their stories about, you know, not being accepted when they were kids, you know, because they're from a slightly older generation as well, so they have, you know, we think things are still bad now, but they were obviously doubly like they were way worse back then. And just hearing these stories and these messages of like appreciation of them saying, it's so nice to have a space where I don't have the pressure to drink as well. Because I think it is so important, you know, like nightclubs and drag shows or DJ nights and all of that. It is such a like beautiful place of like queer joy, as we were saying, and escapism. And it's that real space of, you know, forgetting the world and drinking and dancing around and having a laugh and a good time. But then, you know, sometimes it can go to a little bit of a toxic side. And I've heard plenty of people talk about how either, you know, they had really bad experiences, either through, you know, alcohol abuse or drug abuse, or, you know, predatory people who sort of take advantage of drunk people, for example. And so to be able to come into a space which is explicitly queer, but also, you know, a bit more quiet, essentially. And I think this is the thing, it's sort of, for us personally, with opening the cafe, it was saying, yes, it's amazing to have clubs and bars and all that. And, you know, I'd still love a drink, you know, if I could go out to the clubs. But it's just saying there's more out there. You know, there are more options, and we can have a space that is for everyone, literally everyone within the community and beyond that community as well. You know, building bridges for straight people, for example. Even, you know, people who just don't get the whole gay thing, for example, you know, like they might just not get it. But then if we can actually have a conversation about it, we might be able to build that little bridge between, you know, two groups, essentially. Because as much as, you know, so long as we're looking eye to eye, you know, because sometimes I feel like people just kind of want to hold their boots to our necks and sort of say, oh, why are you complaining? You know, and it's like, no, if we're going to have a debate about these things, we need to be seeing eye to eye. But that's another story. But yeah, just sort of creating more spaces and having more representation and more people included in the conversation. super important.
And I think it's really important, the space that, sorry, Simon.
When you go, Colin.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think it's really important the space that you're providing that's alcohol-free and all the rest of it as well, because, you know, we've got to recognise and acknowledge that actually the LGBT community is becoming far more diverse. You know, LGBT Muslims, and for any sort of group of people that, you know, for whatever reason are not comfortable going into bars, or they don't drink, or they don't like the atmosphere, of all ages, so that we, you know, that space is available to them. And also for some of my clients, because I work primarily now with alcohol users, it's like, you know, just a place that they can go with other queer people where there's no alcohol being served, or at least in an environment where they're not going to be questioned or judged, or be, you know, basically bluntly get the piss taken out of them because they're not drinking. You know, because there's a lot of pressure on people to, you know, oh, you're not drinking, why are you not drinking? You know, or make that a double or whatever. There's an incredible amount of pressure on people to conform and to, you know, almost that stereotype that we see in various things, that, you know, we're all drinking cocktails and
I mean,
whatever off.
Yeah, I mean, as a drag queen, I sort of had a moment of realizing, oh, my job is literally bringing people into a nightclub, and my sort of, on a business level, my success of like my career is, you know, based on how much money the bar makes, essentially.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, pretty much that's sort of like the job, and let alone like I'm drinking to do my job in a way. It's like, oh yeah, we're having a great time, let's do another shot.
Yeah.
You know, sort of bouncing off the walls like energy shots. So, you know, great, very sustainable.
Yeah. I can relate to that, Oskar. Like, often I kind of think, am I, like, my role here is I kind of, part of it is a cog in the capitalist machine of getting people through the door, so they spend money, so the profits are made. And that's it's a hard one to wrestle with. Like, I tell myself, like, we are all just living in capitalism though, and like, we can try and mitigate the damages, but it's an unfortunate and inescapable truth that's where we're at. But I think going back to the kind of discussion about the benefits of sober spaces, I think it's really it's great that we're seeing more variety of queer spaces now. Really necessary. I think it's important to remember that not all queer spaces are going to be suitable for all queer people. And I think sometimes there's a kind of pressure to be like completely accessible to absolutely everyone. And I think there are some places that just aren't going to be accessible to some people. For example, a nightclub is not going to be accessible if you have problems with loud music or flashing lights or crowds. And that's not to say that we shouldn't try to make things accessible where they can be. One thing I've been trying to do is kind of tackle not so much. Well, like I think something that's not talked about much is kind of misogyny in queer spaces. Like, there have been times when there have been guys who have been like pulling faces and like kind of pointing to their friends and looking like, look, there's a woman over there, like, and she's dancing with her top off. Like, oh, that's disgusting. And I've had to kind of step away from the turntable and go and say, look, you need to stop that, or you need to leave, because like, these people are welcome, and this is not I think misogyny is unfortunately part of what goes on in kind of men's queer spaces.
Absolutely. And I think we recently for LGBT History Month did an interview with someone living with a disability, and one thing he said about LGBT spaces was, it's okay if you're not all accessible, try, but I'd rather you be clearer than say you are accessible, because I can work out what's relevant and what works for me. But we've got quite a few questions from the audience, and I wanted to pick up on one of these, which is, are there specific ways in which you've reimagined and implemented queer spaces with these important elements about inclusion in mind during the last year? So I think Oskar starting off with Greenwood during this last year is a very interesting one to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, if you told me a year ago that I would open a queer sober cafe, I'd laugh in your face. Like, you know, because I was downing energy shots at the queerest cabaret in Edinburgh, and, you know, with like the freaks and the sort of fake blood monsters of the local drag scene, you know, just full on, you know, professional alcoholic. So, you know, it wasn't exactly in the cards or anything, but I was like, I'm going to open a queer space. I think for me, part of it did, just sort of for like a, you know, background of it, part of it was that as I started doing, as we sort of adapted drag to be like a digital thing for like recorded, like pre-recorded performances, online content, stuff like that, I had this moment where I was sort of drinking to do it at home. And then I had a moment of like, ooh, this isn't really working, is it? Because it's just not quite as fun as being out bouncing off the walls, you know, on energy shots with, you know, a whole packed room of queer people. And so I had this moment of like, okay, let's not, maybe not entirely sober, but let's have a moment to reevaluate this. And, you know, with all these changes happening in the world, let's just look at what we can do here. And then literally, I think 2 weeks after that, I saw this little Facebook post that said that the small shop was looking for new management. And I shared it literally as a joke, just saying, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had a little queer cafe? You know, got like 50 comments from people saying, yes, 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 this would be amazing, including one from my friend, Zach, who was like, oh, I just saw this too. And I was about to write to them because I need a job. I need to get out of the house. I need to do something. Do you want to do it together? And I sort of, like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, let's do it. Because I don't know the first thing about opening a business. I don't know anything about, you know, contracts and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, with his sort of mindful business and the sort of paperwork of it all, and my kind of creative network and sort of knowing people on the scene and artists and stuff like that, we got it going. And yeah, in terms of accessibility, the other thing with accessibility and how it's sometimes just not possible, at least here in Edinburgh, is, you know, we're an ancient, like medieval Roman Gothic, you know, 17th century city. We got like 50 layers of history, and all of them are about tiny little stairs and steps and, you know, rickety sort of leaning towers everywhere. And there is a sort of little step to come into the shop, but we managed to get someone to make us a ramp, just like a little wooden ramp for wheelchair users, which we have on the side if needed. So we tried to make it as accessible as we could, while also recognizing that there are certain limitations. And, you know, a coffee machine, like the coffee steamer, is noisy. So, you know, sometimes you're going to hear that sort of noise in the background. So we did what we could, especially considering we're just two, you know, two gay boys in our like mid-20s, who've never opened a cafe before, just sort of running around like headless chickens. But we did what we could, and it's honestly been like so amazing, just sort of seeing people's responses to it. And we started a little like GoFundMe for it. And yeah, as we were saying, like just all these messages from people saying, oh my God, I've been waiting for this. I haven't gone to the gay clubs in ages because just the loud music or drinking, or I don't drink anymore, or whatever it is. So to have a queer space that's sober means the world to me. I was like, oh, right. That was when it really became like real in my head, where I was like, right, this isn't just some little project. It was like, oh, this would be nice, wouldn't it? It's like, oh, this actually means something to people. Okay, now let's do it, you know? And sometimes it does get exhausting, and especially after 7 months sitting about in the house doing digital drag, it was a bit of a sort of shock to the system, especially with my chronic pain and all that. But then just as it's like on a day when it's about to get really exhausting and I'm just like really run down by it all, someone will come in and say, oh my God, thank you guys so much for doing this. And they'll buy like an art print or the new Somewhere For Us magazine, or, you know, just this queer joy, as we were saying, just radiating out of them through their masks, of course, staying safe. And it's just like means so much to me. And it just makes it feel like worth it, you know, all the struggle and all the sort of craziness, let alone stay, like, it's great that we can stay open, but we are open during a pandemic, you know? So it's sort of, someone comes in, I'm like, right, this is the one, I'm gonna get the virus, you know, even if he's wearing a mask, it's gonna happen. So there's that sort of added stress of, this could be the day, this could be the customer, this could, you know, let alone if I'm giving it to the little granny who comes down for a coffee, it's like, ugh. But it really does mean the world to me. And I just can't wait to be vaccinated so we can all properly come in and we can have little like events there.
Absolutely, and it's a huge feat to open up such a space with all the changing in rules and regulations and make it such a thriving community hub. So there's 2 questions from the audience. So one of them is, one of the challenges of creating new and inclusive spaces for LGBT folks is access to funding and physical spaces. In this conversation about existing spaces, what efforts must be considered in order to develop other spaces out with alcohol-centered establishments, and if that is indeed seen as a priority? I don't know if David, you want to pick up on that point?
Yeah, I can certainly try to, without wanting to go too much into question 2 if you're going to officially ask it. But yeah, it sounds like from what a lot of people are talking about, we are seeing more sober spaces opening up, or alcohol-free spaces at least. Although that seems to be sort of community-led more. Although I suppose everything we do is always community-led because nobody bothers about us until we start doing stuff for ourselves. But in the sense of what can other organisations or what can organisations do, I guess we can keep pressure on politicians to fund spaces. The likes of Glasgow's still without a new LGBT centre, for example, despite I'm fairly sure that was one of the pledges the new SNP council had said that they would bring one back. There's the likes of as well, just sort of organisations like my own Glasgow Council on Alcohol and other partners of our group can try to apply for funding to set up spaces. And so far, I guess as well, we've talked a lot about spaces as in commercial spaces, but just the thought came to my head while we were doing that so I go to Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm a recovering alcoholic, and also find that we have 2 LGBTQ plus Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in Glasgow, but that's 2 out of 300 odd. And I don't think any of there's one group that has been opened up by a trans woman at the Mungo Foundation in Glasgow, and that's a kind of recovery group for people who've obviously had drug or alcohol problems. But I don't think any other services have opened these, so it's something we can definitely be looking to do. Should we be opening more spaces like that and doing lots of different other activities? It doesn't need to be a support group. It can just be kind of walking groups, or it could be social stuff that we do together and things like that. GCA, Glasgow Council on Alcohol, has a program called Building Positive Pathways, which is more just a kind of social space for people. Not people who have quit drinking, but just people who are looking to cut down or stop. And we can do a lot of that stuff. Some of it without having to apply for new funding, to be honest. It's just not been done before. Some of it, through applying for funding from places and being funded. But those would be my thoughts.
Fantastic.
It's really, I find it really interesting because, sorry, Christopher. It's because it's one of the things that I've been saying for quite a few years now for Alcohol and Drugs Action. I keep saying they are getting better, and we are, I believe, a great service. But one thing, we ask a lot of things at assessment when people come through for support and all the rest of it, but we don't ask if they, if they identify as either being heterosexual or part of the LGBTQ plus community. And it's like, so, and I, it was interesting because I would see people, because I've been in Aberdeen for years now, and I would see people recognize you, good morning, blah, blah, blah. and then, or I'd recognize faces from Grindr or from Cheers or whatever, but it's like, and I was checking, if they got a worker, without breaching anybody's confidentiality, of course, but it was like, they had no idea that there was no mention of anybody being, part of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think we're missing something there because, if we don't know, how, the figures or the people that are coming into our service, how can we give them the best service that they need and the best service that they deserve? We are looking to have an LGBTQ addictions group because some people up here have said, they're a bit scared to go to AA. They've been and didn't feel if it was a safe enough space if they were, to speak about being either, gay or trans or whatever, and so they went once and didn't go back. So it's one of the things that we're looking to develop is a safe space for queer people to come and get support and speak to one another about their addiction.
Can I just come back in there quickly on Colin's point there, because that is definitely something that I found, or still find, at AA meetings sometimes, is that I again will judge the room as to whether or not I feel comfortable talking about sexuality. And for me, my sexuality is part of, or my struggles with it as part of my reasons why I had problems with alcohol and mental health problems. So for me not to share that in that space that I'm supposed to be able to share is a problem. And then there are other problems with some recovery groups. Or traditional recovery groups have a very strong religious focus in some cases, which is also off-putting to people in general, but particularly some LGBTQ people have obviously particular aversions to religion for obvious reasons. So to have more options is definitely good.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think just to come in there, I think the point both of you have really raised is about asking people about, their sexuality, their gender, or their identification. It's a really important thing. And without going straight into service provision, we often get asked this question, or we'll just leave that out because we don't, we want to be seen as inclusive. We don't feel the need to ask. Actually, my view is you're not being inclusive by not asking, because we have specific inequalities as a population of where we can't deal with it until we know what's going on.
Absolutely.
And we need to challenge that. And I think actually this is again back to why communities are really important. By coming together in a community and saying that is an issue that we are facing, because we've had to sort everything out for ourselves. We've had to sort all of our inequalities out, including accessing HIV treatment right back at the start. We've had to do that. And that is where the community spaces are really important, because it allows us to bring everything together and have a community voice and amplify the need to do that. Sorry, I don't want to rant there, but
and if I hear another service provider saying, "Oh, we treat everybody the same," I'm telling you, I'm going to rip their head off and whatever. I just realised it's being recorded, so I won't.
That's all right. I think it's good
it drives me nuts. That it's just like it's like whitewashing the black community. Oh, I don't see your colour. Really? Shut up. Sorry.
No, absolutely. And I think as well, it's really important to actually look at the specific inequalities for different groups. Otherwise, you're just not there to support them. But we had some interesting questions. I will come back firstly to one of the questions that we have on the list, which is, do you think LGBT spaces, or actually we've kind of covered that one. So I'll say LGBT spaces, can they be successful without selling alcohol? And I wonder who wants to pick that up first. And I think we're talking around that subject, but just to pick up any further.
I would say yes, but you have to understand of what the unique selling point is going to be to make them successful. So I think Simon nailed it on the head earlier on when he turned around and said, that clubs are going to be full of people with loud noise and probably alcohol, because that's what makes that profitable. Okay, but we're seeing with the Greenwood Cafe that there is other spaces that can be created and can be developed and made to be successful. I think the problem we've got is we potentially have, or we do have, a smaller population to be successful within, and the running costs of providing businesses that can be successful are really high. So we have to think creatively often about how we do these kind of things. I think there was another conversation that came up around about LGBT spaces out with the big cities. And I think that's a really important question, because there's not really any LGBT venues or spaces out with the big cities. And we've all migrated into, I grew up in a rural area, I had to migrate into a city. So we all do that. And what we're needing to do is work out what are these spaces. And do you know what? Our younger populations are doing it, because they have done that in their schools, and they have LGBTQ groups in schools, and they've engaged. So in rural areas, you're now seeing LGBTQI groups or queer groups in schools. Oh my God, I would have loved that when I was a kid at school.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, speaking as a sort of, you know, alcohol-free space, owner, whatever, I think the thing is, it's, you know, let alone during a pandemic and all this kind of stuff, we really had to be, I think someone mentioned this earlier, but we really had to be multi-purpose, you know? So we're a cafe, but except actually we're kind of more of a shop. And then especially, you know, with this further lockdown, we are a shop. You know, we got like the baked goods and sort of all sorts of groceries, candles, wax melts, soaps, chocolates, teas, all of that. And the thing is as well is we can't, to be honest, can't fully rely on, especially right now, a queer clientele, if you know what I mean. We also have to serve, you know, the middle-aged mums of Bruntsfield or the grannies down the corner kind of thing. But that's sort of part of the power of it in a way, is because it is a space of building bridges, and whether we're, you know, actively having a conversation with them about queer rights or whatever, it's still, you know, we are a queer space, and if you're coming in, you are supporting a queer business. So we've definitely had to be versatile with that, and just sort of having all these different options to succeed as a business. But I think it can happen, you know, and my whole thing is that, you know, we're not trying to like replace the clubs or anything. We're not trying to replace bars or like other LGBT spaces, because it's not a competition, you know, like the whole thing is this is about community, you know, and certain members of the community maybe can't go to clubs, or don't want to go to clubs. So they'll come to a cafe, or they'll come to our shop just to talk to, especially these days, just to talk to a queer person. The amount of incredibly stylish, sort of cozy looking lesbians who come in the most fabulous outfits, and I say, oh, I love your outfit, and they say, oh, thanks, we have, you know, only thing we can dress up for is coming here. I'm like, oh, this means the world to me. And yeah, it's just having more representation in different kinds of spaces, I think is so important. And even if, you know, let's say lockdown is lifted tomorrow and we can go back to the clubs and all that, great. But at least we can be a little bit more balanced, you know, in terms of, okay, we want to go to a queer space. Does it have to be a nightclub? Do we have to be off our faces on alcohol and drugs or whatever? Do we, you know, is that the only option? I think that was my thing for me. It was like, is this the only option? Is this all we have? Is all queer art drag or nightclubs or all that? Like, is that it? Like, surely not. And then realizing, oh no, yeah, there is this huge community of artists, of normal people, you know, just sort of living their sort of quiet little lives and just want to go out and get a coffee or some tea and stuff like that. So yeah, just having more options, I think, is the most important thing.
100%. Oh, sorry, Colin, you carry on.
Sorry.
No.
And I think it's important to, you know, because I think the idea of an alcohol-free space in the LGBT scene is a bit of an alien concept to so many people, because it's just not what we're used to. You know, the first place we go to when we go out in the scene is a pub or a club. And it was really interesting because a few years ago, because I was down in Manchester for Pride, and I'd been to Manchester Pride before and really enjoyed it. And my partner was performing it. There's a thing called Superbia, and it lasted the whole 3 days of the Manchester Pride. And it was just out with Canal Street, out with the village. But it was an alcohol-free space. And to be perfectly honest, I was pretty pissed off because I wanted to be in Canal Street with the big boys getting drunk, you know, and the thought of going to this alcohol-free space, it was like, oh, we'll just go and do for your bit and then we'll leave. To be honest, I had the best Pride ever that year because, you know what? Didn't get hammered, woke up next morning, felt great, was able to go to, they had, you know, events throughout the whole day and films. And there was, you know, the last time they had it, they're making really, it felt like grown up adult mocktails rather, you know, not the usual loaded with sugar and orange and red things in their vial. But, you know, and to be honest, now that's where we go every year for Pride, for Manchester Pride. We go to Superbia because it's an amazing space and it's got so much to offer and it's completely alcohol free. You know, if we decide to go at night to Canal Street, we can, but invariably we don't. You know, so it's you know, maybe it is about it, you know, Prides in Edinburgh and Glasgow and that as well. You know, making sure that there is an alcohol free space that people can go to. It's slightly off track with the question, I realise, but
no, it's really talking about the success of such a space that doesn't rely on alcohol to have that success. But I think it was interesting what Oskar was saying as well before about these kind of multi-purpose spaces and new spaces that have appeared in the pandemic. And I think one thing that's quite clear is the new arrival of online LGBT spaces. Of course, there's been ones before, but for a question for the panelists, what are the benefits of new online LGBT spaces such as digital prides, online community forums, but even sexual social apps like Grindr and Squirt? So I don't know who wants to take that.
I'll go first on that, Christopher, because this is one area where like accessibility is really so much easier. I'm partially deaf, too many years of DJing, but like I would find it difficult to take part in an event like this in the real world, like hearing questions come from members of the audience and that kind of thing. So to be able to take part in something where I can wear headphones, I can hear things quite clearly. It makes things far more accessible. It makes events and groups and discussions and more accessible to people who are disabled in a way that limits their movement as well. And also like the makes participation accessible if you aren't very confident. For example, I think for a lot of people joining in a conversation either like over Zoom or like through the keyboard, it's much easier. So I think there's a lot to be said. Although I think it was Alastair maybe touched on the fact that meeting people in real life is always going to be better than meeting people like trying to get to know someone online. There's drawbacks, there's limitations, but there certainly is a lot of plus points. And I'm kind of like personally, I'm kind of a bit kind of feel a bit daunted by what it's going to be like going back when the assumption is things will happen in person rather than online.
Absolutely, and that actually just picks up from a question from the audience that do you think organizations will or should keep these online spaces ongoing once lockdown is over, or will these people in rural and less accessible areas be forgotten about when city spaces open up again?
I really hope they're here to stay, to be honest. I think the whole pandemic on so many different subjects and sort of topics and areas has proven what really wasn't working before all this. You know, in the good old days, the good old normal days, where everything was fine, except it really wasn't. You know, there's so many things. Like I was going to say, accessibility has become, I feel, so much easier. Even the fact that you can connect with people from all over the place. You know, like even the fact, you know, for example, I can have a performer in my show who's halfway across the world. You know, because you can send me a video, or this panel discussion or things like this could happen with people all across the world, including the audiences, things like that. And yeah, the accessibility has been so much better, and I think it really should stay because it has helped a lot of people, I think. Yeah. Both in terms of just dealing with the current state of things of the world and all that, and it's just a lot of this is actually. Yeah, I think it works better than a lot of the things that were happening before, or can work better, at least.
I think there's been some great innovative pieces of work have come out of this, the pandemic. And I think we'd be crazy just to go back to how it was beforehand and not actually look and just take stock and analyze actually, you know, what worked really well and how can we develop it, you know? And that's from an LGBT point of view, but also from a work point of view, you know. We've got daily check-ins for people with addiction, you know, 10 o'clock every morning, and 7 days a week. We weren't able to offer that before. And it's like, you know, and it's people are saying, you know, they're getting showered, they're getting dressed, you know, because they've got this to look forward to. And also, you know, just from the rural aspect, you know, Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland, you know, are pretty spread out. And I know a lot of guys, you know, quite often use Grindr or whatever okay, for the pickup and the hooking up and all the rest of it, but it's actually to have conversations with the nearest gay guy that's 20 miles down the road. So, you know, I think we need to, you know, we don't all live in big burgeoning cities where there's a thriving gay scene, not at all. A lot of us live in towns and villages where, you know, it's quite lonely. So I think we need to be developing, you know, things like this, or, you know, Zoom, you know, or spaces where people can meet.
Absolutely. And we've actually just had, oh, David, did you want to pick up on that?
Well, I was just going to add as well that so thinking about AA meetings or recovery meetings, like we've obviously had to move to Zoom for those, and it's resulted in, so the group that I'm a member of, we have now people, I think, first of all, I think you can see from this event, I don't know what your normal event attendance is, but attendances at online events are seem to be much bigger to me. At our AA meetings, we're now getting about 30 people from all over North America, Australia. So it's connecting you to people around the world just very easily. So I don't think it's going to, that we're not planning to go back to only in-person meetings. We're going to be sticking with at least one Zoom meeting a week as well now. Because apart from anything else, we don't want to lose contact with the people who have over the past year got to know around Europe and the rest of the world.
We really need to be giving people these choices.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think that's a very good point. As you see, Drew in the chat there has said that online queer spaces have been more diverse than the majority. That's probably true as well, I would say, because
I agree.
Conversation earlier, I don't think it was specifically mentioned, but I always feel that if we're talking about commercial venues, they tend to be gay male or gay by male dominated, or they have tended to be, I think. So I think that's been good too. And just one wee final thing is that in terms of the benefit of spaces in the pandemic, we're currently, obviously SX, one of the partners, doing a community champions project for substance use just now. And the volunteers that we have, first of all, there's been a really surprisingly, in the sense of normally it's difficult to do, diverse mix of volunteers have come forward. And they've said that they have really enjoyed being part of the project because it's made them feel more connected to their community just now. So if that's the case with a small temporary, or well, it's not actually, it's going to run on past this, the initial phase, but I'd imagine that's the case across the board.
Completely. And I think one thing we wanted to touch on particularly in this talk is what do you think is next for our LGBT spaces? So who wants to take that?
I'll take that first, because there's an interesting point here around looking at the, particularly talking about marginalised populations within our community. And we opened up early, Colin raised a point around people of colour. And I think that's a really important point, because we've gone through this, and somebody's raised it in the chat around the ballroom dancing community and how that's actually been a very inclusive place for people. And what we need to do as our community, as sitting in a panel that's all white, is actually ensure the spaces allow people to engage. Because I was wanting to come back to digital point of view, the work we do at SX, we have probably engaged with more people of colour online than we've done physically. And we have been, or I have been told that is because they feel safe to engage with being gay online, because it gives them the protection that they need. So why is it? So what we have to then do going forward is take that knowledge that we are learning today from this kind of implementation and our response to COVID and the learning, because some of it has been really good learning, and make sure that we embed that into the future direction of our community and where it's going to be, because it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both, and they both can link into be synergy going forward as well. So I think it's really important, whatever way we go forward, is we have to make sure that our spaces learn from the inclusivity that the pandemic and being online has allowed us, and look at what learning we can do to bring that back into the commercial world or the community spaces that we go on to develop as communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, fully agree. And I think, yeah, I think that's the thing. And I feel like sometimes queer spaces or bars or nights, whatever, this is the thing, it's a commercial space, so you're thinking about the business and like how much products can we sell, or drinks, or how many people can we get into the bar, etc. And I think, you know, if there's one thing to remember throughout LGBT History Month to remind ourselves of, is that we do have the power to sort of, you know, make that history and to sort of keep making that history. And we do that by being vocal and by being, you know, through activism and actually speaking out, especially for those less represented or those more attacked within our community, like all the transphobia that seems to be affecting the world over, but especially Scotland seems to have a sick sort of fascination with it lately. And I don't know, just sort of standing up more for those members of our community, because, you know, when you do have people creating things like the LGBT Alliance and stuff like that, and, you know, huge politicians starting to say, oh, well, I've got nothing against, for example, trans people, but, you know, like there are people actively pushing against members of our society, of our community. So we need to be as vocal, pushing back against that, not just sort of sitting back and going, oh, well, you know, we've got a gay TV show, so it's fine. You know, like there's so much more to do within that, and to actually stand up and speak out against these things, because we're nothing without our trans siblings, let alone our siblings of color and stuff like that. So yeah, being a little bit more vocal about it all, because we wouldn't have, for example, gay bars without the activism of trans Black women, for example, let alone, you know, all the people who came before us. So yeah, we need to remember that and not sort of get kind of complacent in rainbow capitalism, I'd say.
Also wouldn't have equality without trans Black women as well. That they were fundamental in us starting the road to equality. And it's easy for us as a community to forget that. It seems it's easier for us as a community to forget what people in the 80s did around AIDS. And we need to remember, that's why the historical context of this is really important. We have always got to reflect on where we have come from and where we have been and who has instigated it.
Hear, hear.
Absolutely, and I think everyone's covered it. It's all about unity and what these spaces bring to us, and an ability to come together and look after one another and revel in that joy as well. So there is a number of very interesting questions in the Q&A, so I think I'll start ticking through those. And one actually links quite well into what Alastair was just talking about LGBT spaces and HIV and AIDS activism. So what role can/do community LGBT plus spaces play in supporting people into sexual health services and HIV testing?
Yeah, I'll go first, and then it would be really good to hear what other people think. I think queer spaces have been pivotal in us responding to our health inequalities. They have provided environments which have allowed us, as community-led interventions, you know, engage with our community in a safe space that people feel they can. And I think, you know, the loss of a queer scene, because the queer scene in London, for example, is shrinking so fast, you know, that we're in danger of actually losing the creative work and the nuanced type of work that we can do in these areas, like taking testing to people where they need to be tested. You know, that's an amazing thing to do. So you don't have to make an appointment, wait weeks for an appointment, sit in a waiting room for hours and hours and hours. We're actually taking testing to LGBT spaces. So what I would say about this is they are intrinsical to the work we do, and they will always will be. And, you know, we do lots of creative stuff and we get information out and we try and do it whichever way we think the community might engage to it. But ultimately having people in the community who have these spaces advocating for our work is doing our job for us, and that is an amazing asset we can have.
Absolutely. And does anyone want to pick up on that point as well? I think Alastair said that very well.
I think it's interesting, and I agree absolutely. And also feel a little bit sad because I know, given that we've only got one bar in Aberdeen, which, you know, they won't have, you know, it feels like we've gone back in time a little bit, you know, because years ago I was, you know, with Switchboard and all the rest of it, you know, we were out providing, you know, through the health board, providing free condoms and lube. There was ice buckets on the bar with all these things, and notices about, you know, safer sex and stuff. And and it kind of is in with a little bit of another question that you've got about becoming more mainstream, and I guess, you know, it's in Cheers, and I feel bad because I feel like I'm slagging them off, and I'm not really meaning to, but it's like, you know, if you go in there on a Saturday night, Friday or Saturday night, it's usually 3 hen parties and whatever, in you know, rugby team or whatever, and it's, you know, and they don't want to offend them, so it's like, it's, you know, it's really hard to, and we find in Aberdeen now, to be able to provide that sort of information and to, you know, have that input, you know, and it seems like it doesn't seem, it is for me a backward step.
Yeah, and I think you're so right about how people perceive spaces and what's acceptable in certain spaces. And as we said earlier, that LGBT spaces have to be so flexible in what they're bringing in terms of, are they also that space for information, safe sex, things like that. And I know that the Greenwood has stocked sexual health information, and I know in Hot Mess you've had nights where people have actually distributed sexual health information as well.
I think just to come in on that, oh sorry, Simon, on you go.
I was just going to say, like, I remember, like, when I came out when I was like 19, 20, the first places that I came across, like condoms and lube and any kind of information about safer sex, were in the bars, in the toilets in the region, and in like CC Bloom's, and I think it's really important that any movement to kind of desexualize queer spaces, to kind of keep them profitable or more appealing to like straight folk, needs to be resisted for many reasons, but this is certainly one of them. And yeah, it's been a privilege to have people from SX actually come to give out materials on sexual health at Hot Mess. You're welcome back anytime.
Yeah, same with the Greenwood. I know we have, because that was the whole thing, because we were like, okay, building bridges, we're out here in Bruntsfield, we know, you know, let's say 80% of our clientele are going to be the straight sort of middle-aged mums and grannies and, you know, sort of families and stuff. And yeah, but I was sort of adamant, like, we need to have condoms, we need to have like period products, we need to have, you know, all these resources, because we are a queer space. We've also got like sort of charity like leaflets and sort of booklets for mental health issues from Mutual Aid Trans Edinburgh, who are amazing, mate. Some from SX, I believe, as well. Just trying to have as many resources as we can. And then, of course, especially right now, as we can't have many people in, trying to post them online and trying to sort of make sure people do have some kind of access to these resources. And yeah, the sexual health, like the desexualization of these spaces is like, that's just not going to happen. Because if the whole point of these spaces are for us to sort of come to terms with our sexuality or see other people who are of the same kind of identity as us, our sex is part of that. As sort of gay men, that is the whole point, you know? And especially with the sort of AIDS epidemic and all that, it's like, you know, we've seen the repercussions of this, and it's so important to be, you know, to get tested and to have these resources and to have condoms and to have lube and all this kind of stuff. So I was absolutely adamant on like, we're going to have this. Maybe not a lot of people will see it, but at least they're there. So yeah, that was super important for me.
I think the history in Glasgow has been pretty good on that, the commercial venues, including saunas, have been really good with letting sexual health services in, and I believe still are, although I've not been to as many of them in the last few years. The other thing though to add to that was the poll that I'd posted earlier on. I sort of think an extension of that should be because of the health inequalities we experience around substance use interventions, and so through Gay Men's Health, obviously I know Alastair and Colin used to be involved in, we and SX still do sexual health interventions in bars. I did a project proposal on delivering alcohol brief interventions in bars, because it's very tied in with sexual health, obviously substance use anyway, and riskier behaviours around substance use. So And I'm pleased to see that so far only 43 votes in our poll, so it's not a massive poll, but 91% of respondents saying that they think that there should be drug and alcohol harm reduction resources in commercial venues. So that's which I would agree with wholeheartedly. I think that if they don't allow interventions, that may be a bit too much to be asking bars to have customers talk to about their alcohol use when they're out for fun. But even just to have the information there would be a start.
That's interesting, because it's about having that conversation with the, because we've been told categorically, well, there's no drugs on this bar. There's no, and it's like, and I'm going like, it's almost like what planet you're on, because there's drugs in every bar.
Well, there might not. Let's just take that as face value. Okay, there's no drugs in the bar, but what about when people go to places after the bar? So
yeah, sure.
To be honest, when bars say there's no drugs in this bar, it's a bit like saying my music collection doesn't have steps. That said, what I would say is we are finding in Edinburgh that venues are becoming really engaged with information about harm reduction around alcohol and drugs, and allowing us to put out information and resources to do that. And I've actually played quite a key role in getting that information out and a willingness to engage with training, because it's back to what I said earlier on. Actually, the community and the commercial gay scene, and also the queer spaces, they are people who are opinion formers in our community, much more than I am or ever will be, because they engage with the public all the time. And they've engaged with things like training around harm reduction, around alcohol use. And it's something that's been I think it's been actually quite a proactive piece of work, we probably don't shout enough about, And okay, there will be other venues that don't want us anywhere near it. But in the most part, venues on the LGBT scene do want to engage in harm reduction approaches as well. And they do become part of it, getting that message out as well.
I remember years ago when we used to do that about HIV, HIV, sexual health and HIV prevention. We'd do training stuff with the bar, or there was a couple of bars at one point, and it was, the bosses were completely on board, and it was part of that we get paid for it, and we did a whole, safer sex thing, and about how to start conversations with people at the bar, and they were great, because they were literally going around at the end of the night, offering condoms and lube to the clients. So the fact that you're doing that about, safer alcohol and drug use information, I think is brilliant.
Wholeheartedly agree. And it's so good when people get behind this kind of community effort to get that information out there as well. So we are almost at the end of this session, and we've gone through a few of the questions in the Q&A, and I suppose this one will be the final question before we wrap up. It's, how do we inspire LGBT plus people to create their own spaces all around Scotland? Is there a magic formula that makes it work? Who wants to take that?
Christopher, I was thinking about this earlier when we were talking about, is it possible to have like successful alcohol-free queer spaces? And I think it would do us good to kind of expand our understanding of what we mean by an LGBT plus space. And I was thinking of, for example, for some reason I was thinking about something that I heard about, like when I used to go to church when I was a wee boy, and it was like about what is the church, and it was like anywhere where people gather in my name, that is the church. And like just when queer people come together, that is a queer space. So for example, you got like the Glasgow and Edinburgh front runners, the running group. When they come together and go for a run, that's a queer space. And you've got what you call them, Loud and Proud, I think, the choir. That's not, they might not necessarily be meeting in a building that's owned by queer people, but that's a queer space that's being created. So I think if we just kind of remember that just bringing people together, for whatever reason, that's creating queer spaces. So it doesn't need to be a bar. It doesn't need to be a place that charges money for people to get in. It doesn't need to be anywhere that's selling things. It's just people coming together.
Yeah.
100%. And it's the thing is, we've focused mainly around like bars, clubs, different venues like that, but it's also worth remembering LGBT bookshops, walking groups, running groups, pottery classes, anything where people can feel that safety and connection and community together are really important spaces for queer people.
I think if you want to be just imaginative about it, it's like what Simon was saying, that's like anything that you enjoy doing as a hobby, there are things on that are not queer spaces that they could be. So it's art classes, drama groups, anything you can think of that you like doing as a hobby, you could make into a group or space. Or so yeah, good examples already. And
I think, I think you're right, David. I think it's in the world of HIV prevention, I don't know an HIV charity that has been set up in a kitchen. I think just about every LGBT initiative, LGBTI or queer initiative, has been set up from that very small community space that hasn't been necessarily a commercial venue. It has been that space where it was safe to do so. And I think that's really important to remember, that we do queer things in queer spaces that don't cost any money. Mm-hmm. Same as we do things in queer spaces that cost us a hell of a lot of money, But we can do that, and we can build on that. And I think that's something around, if we look at people out with cities in particular, is the one thing I would like to see change is where queer people in rural areas in Scotland would have the confidence to do that without experience discrimination and stigma. And I think if we can start change, and I don't say we can change society as a whole, because that is a heck of a job at the moment, considering all the things that are going on in it. But if we can at least challenge that stigma and discrimination and allow young people just now, as people age and go through their life course, to enable that to happen, I think that would be something as a community we should be very proud of. And hopefully we can move further on to do that, because the inequalities for people living in rural areas out with the city centres are still absolutely huge. And we need, as a community, to remember that we've got lots of brothers and sisters in these areas that are really struggling to be open about their sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's that thing as well. I'm given my job, the job and stuff about supporting people with alcohol use. I see I think my oldest clients in the 70s and that, and and still living with trauma about being born in a time when it was illegal and stuff. And again, it goes back to that thing when, there's so many people's head I seem to want to rip off. Maybe I've got anger issues when I hear, at another health board meeting, but things are so much better for you gays now, aren't they? It's like, really? Well, they are, but, we forget that, we're a massive, broad spectrum of amazingness. I don't know what else to say. but yeah, there are people in, hey, I've got my bus pass now, I'm 60, but it's like, people in their 70s and their 80s who are still, they're totally closeted, have gone back in the closet, or have never been out of the closet, who are struggling and on their own and self-medicating, and yeah.
Colin, it's just interesting you say that as well, because there was just a new piece of research published in England. It was 10,000 LGBT people who were surveyed, and the mental health and substance use health outcomes have not improved in the past 10 years from the last time this survey was done. Mm-hmm. So as much as people say that thing about, oh, it's so much better now, it's like, well, we're not seeing that filtering through to and it is that historic trauma. And you don't need to go as far back, obviously, as when it was illegal. And this, I mean, yeah, I was born in 1986. I grew up when Section 28 was still in place. The idea of having in the early to mid 2000s, the idea of having an LGBT high school society was
absolutely
insane. So yeah, it's not just the kind of even older. Although now that I'm over 30, I'm put out to pasture, I believe, is the. So.
Not quite yet, David. Well, I was going to say, though, one thing and I mentioned it yesterday in another webinar I was doing, and it was about the pandemic. And I think the sad thing for this pandemic is that our most isolated people in our community have become even more isolated and even more removed from any small, tiny bits of progression we've made, because things like IT can be really difficult to access, both cost-wise, but also because it's difficult to adapt to IT as you get older. And I think one of the things that sticks with me is a gentleman that said something to me a couple of weeks ago about it's a sin. And he's over 65, so he's, you know, he would say, I'm trying not to assault Colin here. So he's an elderly gentleman because he's well over 65, right? And the thing he said, so
clutching my pearls, Ali.
Was that he never had anyone, he hasn't got anyone to talk to about it's a sin. And he lived through all that trauma and, you know, and all that realization. And he hasn't got anyone to talk about it because he's in an environment where he can't be open about his sexuality, and that's called social care. So we still got lots to do, because somebody at the moment hasn't got the same privileges and rights that I do. I'm going to have to, when I end up in social care, am I going to end up having to go back in the closet again?
Yeah. Well, remember, we did that when I was at Gay Men's Health. We spoke at a conference for care home managers, and most of them hadn't even thought about the idea about having anybody LGBTQ, or some of the stories of some people that was horrendous. It was almost like we were there, you know, oh, they're so funny. He was so entertaining. Yeah, we're not there to entertain. We're not there to, you know, whatever. But also some horrific stories of, especially of, you know, trans people, you know, and families coming in when dementia set in and stuff. And, you know, there at least needs to be a lot of education about, you know, people having power of attorney and stuff for situations like that. You know, sometimes your family aren't the best people to give the power of attorney for things like this, but that's a whole different discussion which we can have another time. You know.
Yeah, and I think it's really good that we've had these really big open discussions about what spaces mean to people as well. And I think as we have just under 5 minutes, there's been a really interesting question just at the bottom about the whole discussion, which was, it seems like a great event, doesn't want to assume things, but they're going to ask us, it looks like an all white and all mask presenting panel. How are each of you encouraging not just inclusivity, but more diverse leadership?
I can answer that.
That's my partner, by the way. I gave him my link. That's him in the bottom there, Tolu. So I do apologize.
I'll come in quickly to answer one thing that we are looking to do. So first of all, I would say from my experience working before with Hepatitis Scotland, when we were trying to engage with ethnic communities or people of colour, we found that difficult, and I've always seemed to find it difficult to, whenever I've worked in LGBT settings as well, to get people of colour to engage with stuff we do. We sometimes try, maybe we're not trying hard enough, or we're diverting our energies in the wrong places or the wrong ways. But it does seem to be hard to do, and I think there's probably some element of cultural issues going on there with, like we talked about, people aren't as willing to be visible and physically, whereas online events, maybe they're more comfortable. I don't know. We probably need to learn more about that. One thing that we are looking to do on the LGBTQ substance use partnership in Glasgow is to possibly have a position within our group looking at intersectionality, so that we can try and actually focus on that. And I think I've seen that replicated in other places as well. It's already begun. So.
Yeah, cool.
And does anyone else want to pick up on that at all, Alastair?
I think it's a fair criticism leveled at us about this, actually. You know, and I think what I don't want to do is speak for a population that I'm not part of. So what we have to do is really be better at listening and really be better at getting that information and what we need to know and how we can empower all marginal populations within our community to feel that their voices are going to be heard. And we've had to do that. We've talked about it earlier on today around about disability and things like that as well, that we're really only now starting to engage with disability organisations and think about venues being accessible. So I think what we have to do is reflect on how we do things, but also empower people of colour to be able to engage with us. And we have to listen openly to what they want. And we also have to understand that their difficulties in engaging in an LGBT or a queer culture might be very different from ours. So we have to understand that as well, and I hope the one thing from this event that we all take away from it is this is actually the kind of conversations that start to move things forward. And these kind of conversations and being more inclusive has to be something that as a community we have to take forward, because it is one of the things that annoys me about our queer communities over the years. We have been internally homophobic, we've been discriminated against people of colour, we've discriminated against people of disability. And sometimes these home truths are a bit difficult for us to take, but we do have to take them because we do have to move forward. We have to be more inclusive, both as a community, but also as a way we provide services and involvement in our work.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really good point to end on, that this is part of this conversation moving forward, and hopefully that's a good learning point to move forward for all of us and to recognise some of our own privileges and internal biases as well. But I'd like to thank everyone who attended today and everyone who contributed to this event, and thank you to all my panelists as well. You've all been amazing. And what we will be doing after this, the recording will be saved and we'll be circulating it in the social media for not too long. But thank you for coming. Enjoy your Friday, and it's also Purple Friday, so happy Purple Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been fabulous.
Yeah, I love it.
Very inspiring to hear all your voices. It really means the world to me to be included in this. So thank you.
Lovely to have you.
Thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks.
I'll stop recording now.